So I'm actually one of the originals here. Nick, when did we start this? About a year and a half.
A little over a year. We've been over a year now.
So yeah, I think I've missed 2 of these since we started. And I think kind of one of the cool things about this is we give everybody the chance to kind of get up on stage if you want to. All of us have a story, and some of us want to share it, and some of us would rather listen and soak it in. But after last week, and I always tell JD and Nick that if they need a filler, so I'm kind of the filler. I'm that comedian that comes on before the comedian. So if I get booed off stage, that's okay, because there's somebody better to follow me. Kind of the reason why I chose this subject when it was Greg last week, right? Yeah. How many saw Greg like in his presentation? All right, so there were a lot of people there. There was a ton of people. And Brad isn't here today because he's probably gloating in his chili cook-off wings. So I'll give him a little bit on that one. But Greg actually talked about a lot of things that kind of resonated with me about things that he talked about, like with his father. If anybody recalls, he was talking about how he kind of more or less didn't feel a lot of love from his father, and then he's kind of taken what he grew up with and kind of put into his kids what his father basically didn't give to him. That's kind of more or less what I got out of that. Another couple of things that kind of adding on to that a little bit is over the past, I don't know, maybe 2 months or so when we break into small groups afterwards, there's been some pretty deep stories that have been shared about our dads. Brad, who's not here today, Brad lost his dad about 2 months ago. Tyler, God bless you, buddy. Tyler in our small group, a couple of different times, but specifically last week, and Greg actually happened to be in our small group. And Tyler started talking about his dad. I mean, we're all sitting there like this. I mean, it's tough, Johnny Lickner's going through some things with his dad. The bottom line is that it's just the circle of life, man. I mean, we're all going to be our dad someday, I'm going to wake up one day, my dad will be 80 in September, and I think I'm 80. My dad's a very young 80. There's a lot of 80-year-old guys that are, not so much. So no matter if you're still fortunate enough to have your dad, or if he's passed, or if you're in that circle of life, all of a sudden you're the 80-year-old or 70-year-old or whatnot. Another cool thing about this group is we have people from 27 to 75, I'm guessing, so we did everything in between.
Shout out.
Anyhow, so my presentation today is going to be more or less about dads. I mentioned about Greg's presentation last week about his dad. And Nick, do I need to do anything? There's a retry, remind later.
Swipe it.
Let's go, remind later. Okay. So I actually did some research. And some of my research is going to be inconsequential to you guys, but I think the important thing to this, my dad was born in 1940. So in 1940, we were at the very beginning of World War II, the Cold War with the Russians. And it was interesting, back in the 40s, there's obviously no television, or maybe the very early days of black and white TV was going, but the way people got their information back in the day was basically radio. You'd hover around the radio and listen to, Edward R. Murrow or whoever the people were. That's how you got your news. So can you imagine, like, as a young, maybe my dad's 4, 5, 6 years old, and he's sitting there listening to the radio about World War II and seeing all these people that your family knew that are leaving to go fight the war, and just the things that you're dealing with as you're a kid. And I guess my point of a lot of this is when you're a kid, that's kind of how you develop into an adult. So kind of going back to Greg's dad, Greg's dad grew up differently than Greg did. And our kids are growing up in an entirely different world than we did. In the 50s, the first color TVs came in. It was the Korean War. It was Elvis Presley. And some of you don't even know who Elvis Presley is. But it was funny to think that Elvis goes on the Sullivan Show, and they wouldn't even show the lower part of his body because his hips are gyrating. Seriously? Today, it's like, not so much. Shows back in the day, the black and white shows, my sister's favorite show of all time is I Love Lucy. Lucy. She could sit there and watch I Love Lucy episodes all the time. It's just good American humor, it's just funny stuff. Can you imagine Leave It to Beaver came around in the 50s? Could you imagine a show today on MTV called Leave It to Beaver? Just how we've kind of progressed.
It's probably on the internet somewhere.
But again, I think it was like a time of innocence. You know what I mean? And I didn't grow up in the 50s. I was born in 1963. So when I'm born in 1963, right before I was born, JFK was assassinated. MLK, I think it was like 1966, he was assassinated. The 60s was 1,000% a generation of change. With Woodstock and rock and roll coming in hard, Vietnam for sure. I mean, it's amazing to me how, I'll go to the store, and it seems like every time I go somewhere, where there's a lot of people, I always see somebody wearing a Vietnam War hat. And as much as there were people that, protested that war in a big way, but those guys still wear that hat, Vietnam veteran with pride, from back then. Women's lib, gay rights, I mentioned Woodstock. The other thing in the 60s, the divorce rate starts to go up. And I think, my theory on that is, just kind of things started to change a little bit. People started to become a little bit more independent. And it was a different kind of decade, but a lot of this are stepping stones of where we are today. In the 1970s, when I was a kid, was disco, Star Wars, Roe v. Wade, Archie Bunker. Anybody remember All in the Family? I mean, even if you're young, you should watch some All in the Family because it's hilarious. I watched some of the videos. I was actually put a video of it. I decided not to. But it was one with Archie Bunker and Sammy Davis Jr. Because Archie was a chauvinist. He was a racist, and that was one of the funniest moments you'll ever see on television when Sammy Davis Jr. came his ass. But I didn't put it up to you, but it was funny stuff. The other thing is the divorce rate in the 70s kind of hit an all-time high. It started, trickling kind of up to what it was in the 70s. And then the 80s, where many of you were born, and when I was in high school, I remember it was the first days of cable TV. I remember watching, I think our first cable box had 13 channels on ESPN, WGN Chicago. We used to watch the Cub games. We didn't have the Rockies here. We used to watch the Cubbies. So anyhow, these are just kind of the different decades where either you were born or your parents were born and kind of how things change. Kind of when I mentioned the winds of change, it was interesting that in 1960, so about when I was born, 73% of all children lived in a household with two parents on their first marriage. So that was basically, this is my mom, this is my dad, and these are my brothers and sisters, and it's an every day. We probably sat there and watched Leave It to Beaver and whatever they did. It was just a pretty typical household. Today, which is interesting, only 46% of kids live in that same household. It might be different at Eastern Hills than it is in Northland or wherever. It's just sometimes it's just a matter of where you are socioeconomically. But I think that there's a reason why kids a lot today are maybe a little bit different, just because of their family structure. And today, they estimate that 42 to 45% of first marriages end in divorce, and this is super interesting, that 60% of all second marriages end in divorce. I happen to come from a family where my mother was divorced twice. My mother was married to my dad for 10 years. She got remarried for 10 years, and now she's been with my second stepdad, for 35 years. So my mother said she married for money the first time. She married for money the second time, which was absolutely true. And she married for both the third time. But it worked out. I mean, they have a great life together, and they were, they hold hands everywhere they go. I grab my wife's hand, and she goes like that. I've been with my wife for 35 years. Anyhow, so kind of get into my story just a little bit when I talk about what kids go through today. Depression, anxiety, and I'm going to key a little bit on loss of structure. And I think loss of structure is, when we go back to that statistic earlier, that a lot of kids today don't grow up with mom and dad in their household. That's kind of the basis of structure. Faith is the basis of structure. My situation in 1971, my parents got divorced. I was 8 years old when my folks got divorced. I remember the day, it was right after Christmas, when all of a sudden my dad's packing up and leaving, and I'm an 8-year-old kid. How many people in the room went through a divorce? Like mom and dad were divorced. And it's super, super interesting. 4 of us? That's shocking. I would have guessed at least half the room. But again, maybe that's because of who we are and where we are. Maybe half the hands go up if you're in somewhere else or in a different state. So my dad's basically out. Early 1972, we're still living in the same place. My mom gets married 6 months later. And I didn't know how my dad felt about that until years later when, for obvious reasons, he was crushed by that. But my dad was the kind of guy who never let you know anything. Happy-go-lucky, kind of never let you know that that was a time in his life that was... Now, he went out and tore it up for about 3 or 4 years before he got remarried. But my mom gets, so they filed for divorce. Their divorce was final in February of 1972. And not 4 months later, I want to say in June of 1972, she gets remarried. So she remarries a guy, highly successful. He's a stockbroker. You may remember Betcher and Company. He was a stockbroker for Betcher and Company. Executive vice president. Guy made a ton of money. He bought a big house over by Wilshire Golf Course. If anyone remembers where that is, or knows where that is. And the thing about Jack is that my mom was just reeled in by this guy. Good-looking guy, made a lot of money, but he was an asshole. Okay? He didn't care about me and my brother, so our family's blended. He had 3 daughters, and it was myself, my brother, and my sister. For whatever reason, he and I didn't get along. I could have been hyperactive. No matter what I was like a kid, I was wound. I was a kid. I was like a 6th grader. I was there from 4th to 6th grade. So living there for like about 3 years, and life not being so great, my mother and father decided it was time for me to basically leave that household. So I went to move in with my dad. So my dad, when I moved in with him, I was, I want to say, 13. Well, he was engaged to be married to my stepmom, who's still my stepmom, but she was only 11 years older than I am. So here I am, I'm 13, she's 24, and my dad is 35. So there's 11 years difference between the 3 of us. Well, they were living this life that they had where they were, doing their thing, and they were traveling all the time. I'm sitting there as a 13-year-old kid, and I'm kind of by myself, right? And it was hard, because my brother, it's not like they were in a different state or anything. But my brother and sister were now, 5, 6, 8 miles away, something like that. I was by myself a lot. And when you're in 8th grade, does anybody remember 8th grade? It's a tough year, man. 8th grade is where you're starting to figure out, that you like girls. You're starting to get anxiety about high school. You're starting to think about, kind of what life is maybe going to be. You're not thinking about college or anything like that because you're still a kid for the most part. But that was a time in my life that was extremely difficult. And I definitely suffered with depression. It wasn't like this debilitating depression, but it was depressing. Maybe there's a difference between the word depressing and the word depression. But I was definitely suffering from that. 100% I had anxiety. Because now I'm plugged into an entirely different school system. So I started like in Cherry Creek schools, I go to Denver Public Schools, I get bounced around a little bit. So I remember that year in 8th grade where I never felt more alone in my life, right? And all of us have probably struggled with that from one time or another where you just kind of feel isolated. And I remember times when they were maybe like gone somewhere or whatnot, I was by myself, maybe my brother was there. In the house that we had at the time, I was in this basement by myself. It was tough. But you know what? I got through it. And it was that 1 year. Sometimes it's just the little things in your life that you have to get through that kind of make you stronger. And I definitely look back then and kind of what happened from that point forward, and I just started going like this. That was entirely loss of structure to me. Structure is not having your mom around, which was actually a good thing at the time when she wasn't around, just because it was more of a volatile situation where it was. But I think a lot of kids today suffer with that. And it could be your kids that are struggling with that. And structure can come in many, many different ways. It could come, like for me, structure could be like at work sometimes. Sometimes if you lose because it's happened to me in my life where I've lost something where I'm just kind of sailing on and all of a sudden you hit a brick wall. That happened to me in 2003. In a previous career, I was in just a different sales. I was in radio at the time. And all of a sudden, one day I lose my job, just like that. And it was just kind of that was who I was. Was doing that. I did it for 15 years, from the time I was 25 until 40. So when you're 40 years old and all of a sudden you have a major job career change like that, it affects you, man. It really does. But you got to tighten your belt and just kind of move on. But so structure comes in a lot of different ways. When I was in that 8th grade year, I found this the other day, and this is one of the most beautiful things. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what's within here that really resonated with me. But I found this the other day that was just so right on to me. Dear God, I come to you in my hour of need. I ask that you touch my mind, uplift my thoughts, change my seeming realities that I'm thinking about in my life, change my opinion of what is and what can be. God, I ask that you give me a sense of well-being again. I pray that you help me find my smile, both on my face and in my soul. God, I can't do this by myself, so I turn to you and I surrender. And there were a couple things in here that really hit me. One is when I put quotation marks around the word seeming. This is it could be a philosophical way to look at this word. Because if you feel that your reality is so rock solid that this is the reality, maybe sometimes it's really not so much. You know what I mean? Maybe that reality is something that will. It seems like everything will pass, right? Like you get these times in your life where things are just like, things are never going to change. And then all of a sudden they do. So I think that's why I thought of that word seeming, and I'm like, was that my reality like in 8th grade when I was feeling empty and alone? Sure it was. But in the end, it was just my reality at the time. So I don't know, I thought that was pretty interesting. The other thing that really got to me is help me find my smile both on my face and in my soul. And that's super, super deep for me. Because I think a smile comes from super far inside. You know what I mean? Like there's surface stuff when you watch Dave Chappelle, you're laughing. That's a laughing smile. I think your true smile, maybe it's not smile, maybe it's your true joy comes from within. So I think the way I look at that is not necessarily smile from my soul, but it's maybe finding the joy that you have in life and that coming out in the form of a smile. So those couple of things really hit me kind of good. We're doing good on time, right? Going back to Greg's message last week, he said something, and it wasn't exactly like this, but he said basically you are in charge of your generation, and I try to butcher that a little bit. But the way that I look at that, and I talked about this in the beginning, is, like in the movie The Lion King, where they talk about the circle of life, right? The circle of life just continues to change. It's like, Nate's dad held Nate up one time, you know what I mean? And then all of a sudden Nate holds his kid up. And there's going to be a day when your kid's going to hold his. It's just a constant cyclical thing. So when I think he was talking about some generation, I'm kind of going back to what I talked about in the beginning with our parents' generation and our grandparents' generation. Like my grandfather was born, both my grandparents were born in 1913. I remember my grandma, I want to say she was 16 years old, and she was forced to quit high school. She had to go work. Her family didn't have anything. They were in St. Paul, Minnesota, and she had to work to literally put bread on the table. Because what happened in 1930 was the Great Depression, right? We're so fortunate we're never going to hopefully have to live in it. I mean, all of a sudden the stock market goes down. We're just like, imagine what they were living with. She had to quit high school to go work. That was their reality back then, But again, it's all generational. Like the way that I grew up isn't the way that everybody else grew up, and everybody's kind of their own thing. But I think it's kind of finding your inner smile, finding your faith, just trying to be a good person, and trying to be a good person to your kids. I mean, I think in one of the things I think about my family is, I was thinking about this the other day, like how do you know that you've done a good job as a parent? I think of my family dynamic and my kids, although my son is in San Francisco now, my daughter lives a mile from us. My daughter wants to be at our house all the time. Seriously, she's got 2 golden doodles, and literally that's what we have. I mean, she's at our house constantly. But that's a true sign that my daughter loves her parents, you know. And Nick, whenever I get to see Nick really finds joy in being with his dad, and I find joy being with my kids, and it extends just beyond my immediate family. I mean, I look at all my relatives, like in Minnesota, and my brother and sister and my dad live here, and we get together, we do a lot of family stuff, you know. There's no drama, and everybody's got their own thing. But again, I think just kind of being a good dad is about, your kids being healthy and happy and liking you as a person. I think there's really nothing better than that. So last summer, I take a lake trip every year with my dad, my brother, 2 of my brothers, a couple of good friends of mine. We do a lake trip every year. Last year we went to Branson, Missouri. Been to Lake of the Ozarks. Been up to Coeur d'Alene in Idaho. We go to Minnesota a lot. Minnesota is the one place when I was a kid I remember we took a lake trip every summer. There's just nothing better than having a cold beer and fishing for bass. 6 o'clock on a warm summer night. On the lake in Minnesota. That's kind of my part where I come from. But last summer I was talking to my dad, and I didn't know this, but when I was a kid, I remember, they're divorced, and he used to pick us up just about every Saturday. We'd go to Celebrity. Anybody from here remember Celebrity Sports Center? Yeah, we used to go to Celebrity, bowl, and race the little RC cars. My dad had like an 8-track player in his car, and we'd be either listening to Gordon Lightfoot or Chicago or something like that. But he told me last summer that his favorite artist of all time was Cat Stevens. And Cat Stevens, so I actually researched, because we've never listened to music in this thing, right? I'm not going to sit here and play the entire T for Tillerman or whatever it is Cat Stevens album. But there was this one song on here that kind of resonated. And Nick, do I do anything over here?
No, it should be.
So I'm just going to play this song. Feel free to go fill up your coffee again or whatnot. And the lyrics are on there. But it's a beautiful song about fatherhood and his thoughts about his father. And I just thought I would play this. And it is working. And it's not working.
Cool picture.
It's a song about planes.
Looks like suggestion.
Well, just go ahead and sing it for us, will you?
No, you don't want to hear that. You don't want to let's sing it.
Probably did every year.
I used to try.
Tom, you can sing for us.
Where's the airport?
The anticipation.
I'm actually one that
Doesn't want to do it.
Yeah. Well, shoot, Tom. I'm sure it's not going. I just can't hear it.
so his is the one that's like you can see he's
Does it?
mine is the one that's writing.
Broken.
Apparently he doesn't want us to play Father.
Yep, he got it.
All right, we're gonna try one more time.
One last time.
Eric, I think you got it.
It's not an NBC. It was an NBC theater.
No, it better work or else I
Yeah, you're right.
That's all
You put it on somebody's phone and send it to
We
them.
gotta get Elizabeth.
right. I have it here.
All right. You keep going, Tom. Pretend I'm not a...
That didn't work. Anyhow, it's just a good song. I actually just Googled songs about hip hop and songs, and that one came up like #1. It's a good song. So anyhow, maybe you can.
Oh, it dropped our
Oh, it did.
Bye bye.
Anyhow, our table talks today. I wanted to talk about like memories from your childhood, like things that brought you joy when you were a kid. Like for me, it was every summer going back to Minnesota and seeing my cousins and aunts and uncles, and just things that you remember from your childhood that brought you joy. And then also maybe things that you learned from your parents and your grandparents that you carried on today. It could be, like I remember my grandfather. We grew up Catholic. I remember he went to church every day. He was the one that passed out the tithing. Anyhow, that was kind of what his deal was back in the day. So things you learned from your parents or grandparents that you carry in today, or maybe memories from when you were a kid, or talk about whatever you want.
Guess we got that.
Good day. And I didn't bring the cards today for anybody new.